Okay, so today's game is Liberté. This is a Martin Wallace game. I played a couple of them. What comes right to mind, Brass and Struggle of Empires over here. Mixed feelings. Neither one knocked my socks off. Both are interesting games. There's no question there. But Struggle of Empires bothered me both for the historical and also the amount of awareness you have to have of other people's stuff. Brass struck me as a kind of neat little game, but nothing to really impress me. Now this one, for the subject matter, I've only got one other game that covers this subject matter. I love that game to death. It's Azure Wishes La Révolution Française, which you can catch a video for. To show a little of why I love it. But in this one, because I picked it up in part because of the topic and having something a little lighter, a little bit more accessible, perhaps, would be an advantage. And maybe, hey, I can tap into that same level. But yeah. Now I'm going to go into the rules. There are other people who have handled the rules better, I'm sure. I know Ecomouse does great reviews of these things and is much more familiar with the game when he gives it. This is a first look for me. Why am I going through the rules? Well, in part to help refresh them for me, and also just in case my bumbling through them helps someone else. Hey, it's great. But I did want to speak a little bit about my first impression of the rules. I mean, the pieces are great, but the rules themselves, and the board is actually really pretty. The rules themselves are somewhat annoying. Now, I'm not a person who really likes to look at player aid cards, but I feel like these might be a necessity to even understand the rules at all as to what's going on here. And just because they sum it up in a much clearer fashion. Unfortunately, some of the rules aren't even well described as far as I can tell. Certainly through a couple of readings, I haven't gotten a clear idea that I completely understand. For example, how cards actually get into your personal display, which is something we'll look at. I'll give you what I think the meaning is, but it's not easily derived from the rules. And reading through them, well, there's kind of this initial component description, and we'll go over that. That's kind of cool. The setup, but there's this glossary. And the glossary is sort of the one place that kind of hints how the personal display is maintained without specifying it as an absolute rule. And I usually skip those glossaries because, I'm used to war games, and often that's historical information that you need to play the game. But if you don't have it, you can look it up. It's usually not key information, although I'm finding with the CDGs more and more that is actually a part of the rules. Like an army is defined there specifically. So there's been kind of a trend away from just sort of covering standard terminology, or maybe the standard terminology's moved away, although I've certainly found that the definitions differ from game to game and in very specific ways. Anyway, back to this one. Then we go kind of to the sequence of play, all described in detail. So in a way, the only way to really learn how everything interacts is to be playing it, following the sequence of playing. That's what I'll do in my playthrough, but we'll go over what that requires there. And then the end of the game. There's not a lot of rules here. There's a big thick book, but it's in several languages. And on the back there's sort of this colorful aid to show you what all the things they're talking about are. So when you're reading the rules, you might find yourself having to refer to this several times to see, what the heck is this anyway? So let's start with the overview, and then I'll reshuffle cards and actually start the game. So I think we ought to take a look at the components because that's where the rules kind of start. These are your control markers. They indicate your faction. Now, here's another thing from the read-through of the rules. The second thing I wanted to discuss. It doesn't feel like you're anything in particular. It's not clear what you are. You've got the three major factions in the government, the radicals, the moderates, and the royalists. The players aren't aligned with them directly at the beginning of the game. Now, this may end up working out okay. Games like Russian Civil War are a lot of fun, even though you don't start with an alignment. Your alignment may develop as you play the game, and we'll see if that happens. If it doesn't, it's going to feel like players are too disconnected from any particular alignment for my taste. But anyway, on to the... Let's look at the map itself. So this is going to be an election track. This is just where you track votes coming back from the provinces during an election. It's the turn record track. It contains a few pieces of information. The current turn, what battle is fought in that round and how many victory points it's worth, and then a special effect for the second turn, which adds some pieces to the mix. This is important because each turn sort of ends when all the pieces go on the board, and they don't all come back. In fact, very few of them may come back. I don't know how likely that is, but it seems to me that the pool is going to be pretty small after reading the rules. And then these two indicate some special effects. One is that the royalists can win the game with a counter coup, or whatever you want to call it, with a coup to retake to put the king back in government, and then or a king. The king is dead. And then these markers, which indicate victory point markers, are eligible. If you win an election in that, you get some bonus victory points just for taking that area. It doesn't matter what faction you're supporting to take the area. All right. Over here is your little regular victory point track. It looks rather short. I'm assuming that it's adequate. I don't know. Up here, you have your turn order track. This is determined semi-randomly at the beginning of the game, which is to say the first person is picked randomly, and then you go in clockwise, or in my case, counterclockwise order. After that, it'll be determined through the actual mechanisms of the game. Up here is victory points available for holding positions in government, well, for having certain presences in government, which we'll see in the voting phase. Those are going to be marked up here if you are in the dominant government, whatever is returning the ministry, as it were, you get a marker to indicate that you can do certain actions in the game. The card, and last but not least, here's a place where you put markers to indicate that you want to lead the battle for the turn. On the first turn, there's no battle, but on later turns, there's some decent victory points, and if 20 is a reasonable indicator of what you need to win, these are pretty serious groups of points. The deck of cards, there's two decks actually, an A and a B deck. We'll take a look at the A deck so I don't have to reshuffle the B deck, but that gives you some certain time progression in the game. Once the A deck runs out, you move into the B deck. So your primary type of cards are either personalities who are linked by a color to a certain area of the board, and that's the only place that they have influence initially. They also have a color that they're aligned with, so this guy is a royalist. And there's a little indicator of where on the board you'll find their region, their name, whatever, in deck A. And then there's clubs, which are also aligned to a color and don't have a region because they can be played anywhere you like. When you have a little cannon on there, it means that that is a group or a card that can be played towards the battles. Okay. And then there's, I don't know if, here's one. There's cards which are special cards, which are essentially just events that take place. We may touch on those later, I'm not sure. Okay. So, the game is mostly set up. Everybody's going to get a hand of 7 of these cards. And In addition to their hand of cards, they also have this personal display, which I believe can hold four cards that you've played but don't want to get rid of. And they can be used to break ties in various circumstances by recommitting that person, and then you have to discard them. Or you can leave them there and you get them back in your hand, which looks like a powerful way. You're going to put your best cards there, I think, the ones that are most important to you. So they're either ones you want back or you want to break a tie with. And in either case, better cards work stronger there. Okay, so the basic first thing in any given turn, some of these don't happen on the first turn though. For example, player order doesn't happen on the first turn. But every other turn, it's based on how many accumulated victory points you have. The first player is the one with the most victory points, followed by the next most. In ties, it's random between the tied players. Then you're allowed to refresh your hand. You pull back your personal display, those cards that you've played in front of you that you want to either keep or use for something else that you haven't used for something else. So they make it over to the next turn. And then you can discard as much of your hand as you wish. You may have some crappy cards left, or ones that don't make sense to your situation anymore. And then you refill up to 7 cards unless you have 7 or more cards already, in which case you're allowed to keep the excess cards. Now, how do you draw? It's not just from the top of the deck. Instead, the deck will, let me just put part of the deck here, I'll be here, and 3 cards will be face up available for you. And you have the choice. You can pick any one of the face-up cards, or you can pick the top card. If you pick a face-up card, it's immediately replenished, and you get the choice again for each draw. And that's just how drawing is going to happen throughout the game. Okay. Then we go into a series of action rounds. And these continue as long as all of these factions still have pieces. As soon as one faction runs out of pieces, we finish that particular round. Everybody gets their turn. Nobody gets left behind. And then we move on to the next area of play. Now, for these cards, you have 3 options you can take. You can either play cards, take cards, or pass. All right. Well, let's look at playing cards first. If you play a personality, they're limited to being effective only in the color zone, or their zone, that they've got a power base in. And you will take up to 3 tokens of their type. Well, up, and the number indicated on the card, up to that number, and you can create a stack or stacks and place them in provinces. I believe you're allowed, you're allowed to place it spread out. You don't have to put all the entire stack together at once. You can spread this guy out within his province, for example. Or you can stack them together. There's a limitation on stacking, and you can inject into stacks that already exist with a card. A single stack can only contain up to 3 faction blocks. It has to all be the same color. A province may only contain up to 3 stacks. A player can only have 1 stack in any given province. And all the blocks in a stack belong to 1 player. So you would mark your stack with one of your counters. Now let's say you spread out, which makes a lot of sense perhaps originally because you're trying to claim territory or whatever. Then you would have markers on all of them to indicate. What this indicates is support for that faction under your control, right? So it's not just pro-royalist, it's pro-royalist that you control. And it's important here, like in Russian Civil War, that players kind of have to view themselves as sort of the underlying interests behind some of these factions. You have certain desires, whatever they are, and they're not specified in the game, that you can get into power no matter what faction is there. You can get what your goals are, whatever faction you're playing for. And, you know, you can extend that in your own mind as to how that works. I don't have a real problem with that. Okay, so if you play one of these, the gray-backed cards, works the same way, except you can play anywhere on the board. That's one way you can play. If you got a cannon on the board, you're allowed to place a control token in the battle box. You grab one of your control tokens and drop it in there. And that just indicates that you have committed towards fighting this battle. The more tokens you have in there, the more likely you're going to be the one who gets the glory for that battle. If you play a card, you have the option of either discarding it, in which case it goes in the discard pile, which I assume some of the special events can pull back out, or you can put it in front of yourself as part of your personal display. You're only allowed 4 cards in your personal display. I don't have a Sans Culotte marker somewhere. Let's see where they are. They're these little, look like gunners almost. Guys on the barricade. If you have that on your marker, on one of your personal display cards, you can have 5 cards there. I don't know if there are further effects of them, but that's a fairly advantageous one. Generals, another thing that shows up on here. If you have them in your personal display, you can use them to break the ties as to who's going to get the glory for the battle. Okay. So, when you play one of these cards, you have a few options still, right? You can either play for votes, but if it has a cannon, you're allowed to play in the battle area and try to gain those kind of large victory points. Not on the first turn, but again later on. Alright, if you happen to play only a card that's only worth 1, you're allowed to play another card that's only worth 1. That's an expansion apparently in the 2nd edition rules, and they suggest if you don't like it, you can play just straight up. But I guess it means that the level 1 cards end up getting drawn from the pile. Whether or not that's a good thing, I don't know. Okay. So that's one of your choices of actions. And in addition to that, you're allowed to play a special card if you have it in your hand. You can play one special card to have its effect take place. And there are a few kinds of special cards described in the rules. I don't know if they're the entirety of the set. They seem to explain what they say on them. But I think it's important that they're in the rules, that they're all in the rules because of the multilingual capabilities of the game. The game covers English, French, German, Dutch, Dutch, Netherlands, Dutch. You know, I mean, I don't know what they actually call their language. Italian and Spanish. So that can be pretty useful. I have disagreements with printing it all in one book, but maybe it's cheaper to do it that way than sort out the distribution. And it's certainly easier when games come over from Essen or something and you don't have the rules in your language. Okay. So what do we got here? Let's take a look. Right. So after you do, if you choose choice A, which is to play cards, that's what you do. If you choose choice B, it's to take cards. Taking cards means that if you have 9 or more cards in your hand, you must first discard 2 of them. Otherwise, you don't discard any. Then you may take a card, and again, you can take either a face-up or the top of the pile. If you take a face-up, and it's a level 1, well, if you take a face up, it's immediately replenished. If you take a face up and it's a level 1, and there's another level 1 up there, you can take that one as well. That's the only chance of getting 2 cards, though, that way. All right. So you're playing all these pieces here and over in the battle. To what end? I mean, well, that's where we go. So the first point where you're starting to get some scoring and some reason for what you're doing is in the battle phase, which follows on every turn except turn 1. Okay. And there's a basic mechanism I need to explain for this, but let's take a look at the basis of it, and then we go to the mechanism. Everyone who has at least a general, you have to have a general card face up in your personal display, and a control token in here, is eligible to lead the army. If you're eligible, whoever has the most tokens in the battle box leads the army. And they get the number of victory points available for a given battle. That's a big amount of points, I think. However, if there's a tie in the number of control tokens, each player in player order is allowed to advance 1 card with a general marker. Now, see if we can find one. There's a Sound Skull for you. Looks like they're pretty rare, huh? Well, the first deck is probably not going to have as many. Here's one. Moral. Alright. So, he has a general marker. He could be advanced to break the tie. Now, this is a standard tie-breaking mechanism. You'll see it in the elections and in some other parts as well. You advance the card forward. That's saying, I'm going to commit this guy. He's no longer going to be in my hand. He's going to go to the discard pile, but I want to win this. And then whoever advanced the general with the highest value in little blocks wins the victory point for the battle. Now, these have to be people who were eligible to win the right to command. They had to have the most tokens in here out of the people with generals on their track. You don't have to commit your general unless you're trying to break the tie. If you win it, you get the victory points and you mark them immediately. If the tie is not broken, nobody leads the army. And I assume this also happens if no one is in here. If no one wins the army, the battle's a lost battle, and you put a white faction block over the battle. And that's going to count as a counter-revolutionary, a pro-royalist victory in terms of areas controlled. They need to control these areas with the little white fleur-de-lis on them. Well, winning a battle counts as one of those areas for them. Okay. And that can end the game, as can a revolutionary parliamentary victory, which would install God knows what. Okay. Then we go to the next victory point section, which is the elections. And these are going to be done following these numbers, starting in Normandy and moving down just through the track from province to province to see who wins each province, who wins the provincial election there. And the way this is determined is whichever stack is the largest in any given province wins the votes for that province. Okay? Well, there's a stacking limit of 3, so if people have struggled over it, there's a good chance that there's going to be a tie. And then the winner is going to be the person who advances the most valuable leader who matches that color. He doesn't have to be from the same provincial area. He just has to match that color of unit in order to break the tie. Okay, let's look at how these work out. Let me grab the pieces. So if you're alone in an area, you just won the area. You remove one of the squares from the area and take it for yourself. That's to mark how much control you're going to have over the government if it elects that color as the ministry in power or whatever. I'm going to have to break here because I'm running low, and I'll come back with some more. Okay, now let's say we had a tie between a couple players, or even 3 players could be tied in here. Let's make it easier. Okay, so we have 2 white and 1 red. It doesn't matter that there's 2 white. That doesn't mean white's going to win. The guy who's going to win is whoever advances the highest valued general for their color of pieces, or the highest level politician for their color of pieces, or club for that matter, in this particular election. It's a tied thing, same situation as with the generalship. So let's say this is purple, and this is his hand. He could advance this from his hand. And that would assure that nobody's going to beat him, because 3, I think, is as high as it goes. But if he didn't want to, if he wanted to advance this, now these are all open information. Maybe somebody else has a 3 and they could beat him. Or maybe somebody has a 3 and they could tie here. Okay. So in the event of any of these cards being pushed forward, remember they're going to be discarded. Whoever pushed the highest one forward out of the tied players will win. What do they do when they win? They remove 1 block from their stack, and then we move the marker up in favor of the color that won. The marker moves up also if you're alone. It doesn't require a conflict. I just forgot to mention that. It's also possible to have a situation where nobody wins the election. Possibly they tied on these, or nobody wanted to commit, or even there were no markers here. In that case, well, if there's no markers, it just doesn't, the election doesn't really win. But let's say it's a situation like this, and either neither player wants to push forward a card, or they both push forward the same valued card. And you might want to do this even if you're not going to win, to prevent somebody else from getting a victory, or more importantly, perhaps, to prevent their faction from getting a victory. In that case, you have a tied situation, and this is the only time when these squares come off the board. All the squares in the province are removed from the board and placed back in the pool from that particular election, which means the area is completely up for grabs again. Other victories, when there's a victory or whatever, the person who won, the person who had the largest single stack and committed the best leader out of any ties with other larger stacks, loses 1 piece from the area, but otherwise all the pieces remain, and they just remain throughout the game. So I don't know, the way the game is going to play out is going to determine how many pieces there are going to be for the next turn of the game. But it does seem to me that there are going to be a lot of pieces lying on the board where people won stuff. They maintain support. Okay. But as the elections are going, these markers are going to be moving up based on each province won. And in general, that's 1 each. There's an exception for Paris. Paris has its own special little rules. When you win Paris, you take all of your blocks out of your stack. Paris is very volatile, okay? And whoever won it last probably won't have a chance to win it again. And they advance the total vote marker a number of spaces equal to however many blocks they removed. and they hold those blocks in their own hand, that's going to be important for how much control they have over that faction. But they've also boosted that faction up to 3 points. If there's a tie in Paris after advancing cards, then those people who tied are allowed to advance another set of cards and another until they stop, or the tie is broken. If the tie is broken, the winner is whoever broke the tie. So you can commit a lot more to Paris than you can anywhere else. And remember, all of these are going to be discarded afterwards. If the tie is unbroken, no votes are registered, and all the faction blocks are removed from Paris as normal. Special space, definitely. Then there's these victory point provinces, which I've already alluded to. They either contain 1 or even 2 victory points for their value. On turns 3 and 4, marked by this down here, if you win the election there, you just get those victory points. So that's kind of another way to get victory points. So far we've seen the battles and we've seen this. Now there's going to be another way, which is from winning control of the government. But that's pretty hard to do compared to fairly simple tasks. This is a singular simple task. This is a singular simple task that gets you points. All right. Well, to control the government, you have to form the government. And the government is formed after all the provincial election results come in. Whichever faction is furthest along on the track has just won the election. And they become the government in power. Whoever got the second most votes, we got a tie there. We'll get back to that situation in a moment. But whoever got the second most votes is the opposition party. The third, they're so far out of it that they don't really count at all. Okay. Now you're going to get, if there is a tie for either the primary government in power or the opposition party, that is resolved by players in player order advancing a card. And they have to advance the faction color that they're supporting. So I can't use a blue guy to push the red vote total up. Of course, if I've got a lot of blue cards in my hand, in my personal display, I probably want blue to win. I've been playing for blue with my hand. But maybe you don't have a lot of control over what your hand is all the time. Okay. And once that's advanced, that can determine what your position is. So if we had a tie for first place, for example, this guy would go up here, and this would become the opposition. If instead we had a tie for second place, we would just push the loser backwards. That can stay as a fixed tie, as a tie that, and you keep repeating the process as you do in Paris elections. Players can keep pushing the vote forward. And it does not have to be the same players. Okay. It looks to me like the way this works, you may just, it's not defined, but you may just add up the votes of all the players going for one faction if they push forward. The tied faction that has the highest value. Okay, let's look up what value is. That looks like it's been defined. Determined by the quantity of faction blocks on either side, 1, 2, or 3. Yeah, no, it's the highest single card. So 2 people can't put 2 2s up and beat somebody who's got a 3. Okay, what they could do is put a 3 up, match him, and then maybe have more cards in total. But one dominant personality can still win the general election that way. All right. The tie can remain unbroken, however. It's possible that a tie cannot be pushed forward, in which case the radicals always win and the moderates always beat the royalists. I think that's an unlikely situation because the stakes here are fairly high. Okay. Now you get victory points, and you get victory points from those squares that you've collected for the elections. For every square you have, well, whoever has the most squares for the dominant party is going to get 5 points. Whoever has the second most is going to have 2. And whoever has the most squares in the opposition party is going to get 3 victory points. But again, there could be ties here. And again, you resolve ties by pushing forward a card. If it's the highest valued card matching the faction color of the particular faction that you're trying to collect points for, then you collect those victory points. You repeat this, as with the general election, until there's only one player standing, but it's possible you could end up in a situation where nobody can or wants to play a card. And if that happens, then the points are kind of split. And this is kind of cool because it generates points. So if first place for the government is split, you each get 3 victory points. If second place for the government, each one gets 1 victory point. And interestingly, second place is still awarded with the first place. That's kind of weird. And for first place in the opposition, if it's tied, each tied player wins 2 victory points. So if it's 2 players, it's already generating more points, right? 2 players with 2 is worth 4, and this is worth 3. But it could be more than 2 players holding this tie. So a lot of points could be generated across the board by ties. And maybe people can cut little deals to cause that to happen, depending on how you feel about table talk. All right. At this point, everybody gives back. Everybody who has at least 1 square of the color that has the presence in the government puts one of their control markers up there for presence in government. That'll indicate, this is just to mark where the vote, what province is currently being voted on. That'll indicate the ability to play certain special cards. There are certain special cards that I guess only come into play. You can only play if you are part of the actual government, if you can pass the laws to do it. Okay, how does the game end? Well, normally it ends through 4 turns, I guess, or at least that's the designed end. After 4 complete turns, whoever has the most victory points wins the game. If you have a tie, you advance a card. No. If you have a tie, the highest total value on all the cards in your personal display wins. So you would add all the different values that you still have in your reserve from that turn to break the tie. And that's sort of your resources that were uncommitted to push you to a victory. And it doesn't matter what colors those are. It is possible, though, if that ends up as a tie, that multiple players can share the win for the game. Okay, but there are special victory conditions. One is, if in a provincial election, the red faction has at least 17 territories, the radicals will instill some really severe form of government. And they will win the game. Well, they will win control of France. So then the player with the most red points, the most, red blocks, no? Red points, Red points are something that just got made up for this role. It's going to be a sum of the number of red faction blocks you have, and that'll be both in your hand from winning provinces and on the board itself. And also, all red faction blocks shown on your personal display and in your hand. That's interesting, because there, cards that you haven't even played from your hand are going to count, and that's not the case with the other end of game victory points. Okay, now going on, another option that could end the game early is a royalist counter-revolution, and that's if 7 of these fleur-de-lis are controlled by white stacks. This happens immediately, but on turns 3 and 4, at any time except during the election phase. It's important that it can't happen during the election phase because you could be partway through the elections and be in kind of an inconsistent state. All the elections have to be returned before that can change. And that's actually when it's likely to happen, right? Unless there's cards that shift the control over. Okay, well, if that happens, and there's additions, which is each battle lost by the by the French Republic counts as a royalist area. So that can reduce the amount below 7 that you need. Okay, if that happens, the player with the most white points is the winner. And those are determined the same way, I hope. All white faction blocks on the board, all white faction blocks shown. No. Okay, so you do not get anything for the blocks that you have from the election. Those don't matter. They're bought into the Republic, so they're not worth anything. But faction blocks you have on the board count, and faction blocks on your cards, and is it both sets? Cards in hand and personal display, yeah. In these cases, if either of the automatic victories happen, it doesn't matter how many victory points you have. Winning is just determined by the guy who supports that radical faction and has the most power in it at that moment. They're going to instill some kind of either the monarchy again, probably under their control, or a radical dictatorship of some sort that's lasting. Okay, let's go to the special case cards very briefly. They list a few of them here. So, bread shortage. Remove a faction block of the same faction color as the current government from any one province. And you can just pick anything you like, and remove it from the board, thereby giving yourself a little bonus. You probably want to hold this towards close to the election for the extra swing. Emigration. Remove a player's white personality card, white blocks, from a player's personal display, and it goes into the discard pile. If discards can come back, which I think they can, but I don't know, this would allow that to happen. Religious problems. Remove any one moderate or radical, blue or red block from any one province. It goes back to the supply. A little bit more targeted. The guillotine. Remove any one personality card from a player's personal display. The affected card is decapitated and returned to the box. So that's very specific, that it's returned to the box. I don't know how cards come back into play. I don't see any indication here, but this would remove someone and they couldn't come back to play from the discard pile there. And then there's two more, purges and terror. The purge allows you to remove a club or personality from a player's personal display and place it on the discard pile. No big difference, but it requires that you have a presence in the government. And then the terror, which allows you to remove an entire stack of faction blocks from any one province containing at least one red stack. It can be any color. It can even be that red stack. You can also remove a club or personality card from a player's personal display, and that is going to be decapitated and returned to the deck. Now, returned to the box. Now I see no indication that cards get reshuffled or put back in this game. Hold on. As soon as the deck is discarded, you reshuffle I got you. So it is possible there's a reshuffle, and the A and B decks will be shuffled together at that point, creating a bit of chaos, but bringing some of the older people back. I thought the deck was too big for that to happen, but we'll see. It probably isn't that big. There's a lot of cards going to be coming out. I'm kind of looking forward to this. I certainly was interested enough in it to pay a reasonable amount on it, and you know, I think it's going to be an interesting game. As usual, I'll give you kind of a deeper playthrough early on, and then as I get more of a feel of the game and I'm less worried about the mechanics, just hit the effects, I think. Alright, up it goes.